Hey guys, this is Fielder William Strain here. Today I'm going to go in detail on how to create a gradiated light on a flat, shiny object like this knife right here, so that you can take your image from this to this. So before I get started with how to create a gradiated light on a shiny surface, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to create a gradiated light on just a regular surface, like a background light on the wall. So let's move back to the background light and talk a little bit about what that involves. So there are two basic ways that I create a gradiated light on a background surface like this. First off, I just have a light with a reflector cone just facing a wall. Sometimes I end up using some cardstock or a piece of poster board or something like that just to change the color, but it's pretty basic and pretty simple. With a reflector cone, as it is right now, the image looks like this. If I want to control the light a little bit more, what I end up using is a honeycomb grid. This is a 30-degree honeycomb grid. The only issue you have with these is you've got to adjust the light output a little bit. So this eats up about 1.5 stops of light, maybe 2. But if I put that on, what'll happen is the gradiated light will go from bright to dark a lot faster. So let's check out and see what that looks like. So with the reflector itself and the honeycomb grid, you can end up doing a lot of things. You can also manipulate the size of the gradient a lot by moving it forwards or backwards, but you can also do another thing to manipulate it by adding a piece of diffusion material. I have two options that I like to use. One is I have a couple of sets of barn doors that come with these little inserts, and I'm able to just insert the diffusion material into the barn doors. It's a little bit more user-friendly, but I've only got one option as far as the diffusion material. The second option is I've got a set of Roscoe diffusion kit. It has a lot of different diffusion materials from thick to thin to frosted, and gives you a lot of different types of materials you can diffuse the light with. So if you want to create sort of a very subtle gradation and change just a little bit, you can add this right here to the light, and that way soften the light just slightly. Boom. Nailed it. So as you can see, by adding a piece of diffusion material on the reflector with a grid, it changes the gradient very subtly. It really creates a slightly subtle difference between the highlight to shadow on the wall. Between the three things, the cone, different size grids, and different types of diffusion material, you're really able to manipulate the gradient quite a bit. But there's another way to create a gradient, and I want to talk about it next. So the second option for creating a gradiated light in the background is by using a piece of diffusion material and putting the light behind the diffusion material, shooting towards your set. In this case, I've got a roll of Savage plastic, and the light is pretty much set up exactly the same with a reflector and a honeycomb grid inside the reflector, although I did reduce the size of the honeycomb grid to a 10-degree grid instead of a 30-degree grid. There are some advantages and disadvantages of using a piece of diffusion material. One of the disadvantages is that I'm limited to only having white. So if I want a different color, I can't put a piece of poster board or anything like that to change the color. I generally just change the color in Photoshop after the fact. Another disadvantage is because it's white and it has to sit closer to the set, is that sometimes the lights on the main set will bleed onto the background, and that'll create more of a gray instead of a black in the darker corners of the gradient, which can be something I'm looking for and sometimes isn't. One of the big advantages of using a piece of diffusion material is that I'm able to hide the light a lot easier. I don't know if you could tell, but when I had a clip on top of here to hold a piece of diffusion material when it was shooting against the wall, I was having a hard time hiding the little clip, and it would pop up at the bottom of the screen. So one of the cool things is I can now put this light anywhere behind this piece of diffusion material and you'll never see it. Another slightly advantageous thing is that when you're shooting it directly off of the background, what you end up getting is sort of an oval shape, because you either have to shoot from below or above or to one of the sides to light the background. With a piece of diffusion material, I can place it directly behind my subject and create a perfect circle if I want to. So there's some pluses and minuses to doing both. In this particular case, I don't want to use either of these. What I want to do is I want to put some wood paneling to fit the overall scene. So I'm going to swap out this piece of diffusion material for some wood paneling, and then I'm going to move the light to the front and put a gradiated light off of the wood paneling from the front side of the set. So let me switch that around and I'll get back to you. So really quickly, before we move on to talking about creating gradients on a shiny object, I just want to catch you up on what I've done with the background itself. So what I've done is I've created a wall of wood paneling right here, and I've done exactly the same thing as I did on the blue wall itself. I've got my light right here with barn doors and a grid on the front of the barn doors. I've got a piece of diffusion material clipped to the front of the grid in front of the barn doors, which is creating a nice graded light on the wood paneling that goes from light to dark on the outside edges. So I've created a nice gradient and a totally different look that more matches the knife itself. So let's talk a little bit about creating gradients on the knife. So now that I've talked a lot about how to create a gradiated light in general, it's now time to move on how to create a gradiated light in a reflective surface like this. What you have to realize is that reflective surfaces, whether they're chrome or black or any other color, they're essentially a mirror. And the way you light a mirror is you don't light the mirror directly, you light what is reflected in the mirror. If you can understand that, you basically can understand any part of this. So far, I've been lighting the knife with this small strip box right here. It's creating a very large highlight along the main body of the knife, because it's reflecting from the strip box off the body of the knife and into the camera. If I create a gradiated light on this side where the strip box is, it'll create a gradiated light to reflect off the main body of the knife and into the camera. So I can light it in the same two ways that I lit the background. I can either A, put a piece of foam core board or something white on this side, shine a light from this other side off of the board and into the knife, and then into the camera. Or the second option is I put a piece of diffusion material on this side and light from behind the diffusion material through it onto the knife and into the camera. My preferred way of lighting a background is to light the background directly, the way that I'm doing right now, with a gradiated light directly shining off of a background and not through a diffusion material. The way that I prefer to light a reflective surface is to light through a piece of diffusion material. It's a lot easier for me to choose a different type of background and light it directly, but it's also a lot easier for me to light through a piece of diffusion material to light the knife. The same two advantages exist. The main big one is that I'm able to hide the flash really, really easily, and I don't have to worry about it accidentally showing up in the reflective surface of the knife blade. The other thing is I can move it in any direction around the piece of diffusion material, and it gives me a lot more options. If I'm got a light on this side and I'm bouncing it off a piece of foam core board, I'm constrained by this pole or anything else that might be over here. If I move it too far over, I could end up getting the shadow of the knife. And also if I move it too far over, I could end up inadvertently lighting this side of the knife. But if I light with a piece of diffusion material on the other side, all I end up doing is lighting exactly what I want to light. If I want to light this side over here, I can add a second, third, fourth, fifth light to light any portions of the knife on the other side that I want. The last thing I have to think about when I'm lighting this knife right here is that there's not one but two flat shiny surfaces. There's the main body of the knife, but there's also the blade or sharp edge of the knife that I'd have to light as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a piece of diffusion material over here, and then I'm going to figure out how I can create a gradient. My goal with the gradient is to gradiate the highlight where the logo of the knife is and down towards the tip of the blade. And then I'll create a different but unique gradiated light on just the blade itself. But first off, I've got to put a piece of diffusion material on this side. So let me get started with that. Now that I've got the diffusion panel in place, I went ahead and put my light in place where I like them. What I like to do to figure out where to place the light, since I can't see the reflection through the camera and move the light at the same time, is I hook my camera up to capture one and put on live view, turn on the modeling light on my light, and then just move it around and get it pretty close. I'll take a shot, adjust it a little bit more, take a shot, and so on and so forth until I get it dialed in exactly. Then I'll move to the next light. With this particular light, which is the light that's on the main portion of the body of the blade, I've got it facing down slightly so that it'll create a more subtle gradient as it goes from the top to the bottom of the knife. With this one, I've got the gradient going from about the mid-bottom section up to the top portion of the knife. Let me show you the image as it is right now so that you got a good idea of what I've done so far. One of the things you'll definitely notice is that there's a solid cutoff line on the blade edge of the knife as the knife starts reflecting the edge of the table as opposed to the diffusion panel. The way that I'm going to end up fixing that is I'm going to lay in a piece of white paper or cardstock, and I'll end up compositing in a second image and blending that in right where the gradients meet. There's really no way to fix that other than push the table all the way back so that there's no defining edge as it hits the table, or move it up some on like sort of a log or something like that to avoid it reflecting the tabletop surface. But since I don't want to do that, I kind of like the image as it is. I'm just going to do a quick 2-image composite, more than likely. One of the things you'll probably notice about that image as it is right now is that the tabletop surface is completely black. So I'm going to add a fourth light directly over top of the knife, and I'm going to create another gradient along the bottom edge of the image. So I want the bottom edges to be dark, and I want when it gets to the knife to be nice and bright, so it's a spotlight right over top of it. But it's the same system that I've been doing so far. I'm either going to use another small reflector cone and a grid, or if I want it to be a larger, broader light source, I might use a beauty dish with a grid on it. I got the final light in place with a beauty dish and a grid on the front of it. It's lighting the tabletop surface really quite well, where it's darkened on the bottom corners, but it's also adding quite a bit of fill light on the handle of the knife itself, so I don't think I'm going to have to add a fifth light to help out the lighting on the handle too much. I did make 2 other changes since adding this light. The tabletop surface itself is looking very red and saturated, while the background is looking very desaturated and kind of washed out. So what I did is I fussed with the light on the background just a little bit, but I also added a quarter CTO gel to kind of create a little bit more red and saturation in it. In Photoshop, I'll probably bring down the tabletop surface and bring up the background just a little bit and kind of match the colors a bit. The other thing that I did is I added a white card to highlight or rim light the back edge of the knife handle on the dark side of the knife. I'm using just a little small card on 2 A-clamps. I've levitated the card above the set so that I don't get a highlight on the tabletop itself, and it's just lighting the knife. Other than that, I think this image has turned out pretty decent. I really like the way that the gradients on the main portion and the blade of the knife have worked out. Like I said before, I'm going to end up doing a composite to kind of finish off the gradient on the blade or the sharp portion of the knife. So let me show you the 2 final images, the one that I'm going to use for the blade and the one that I'm going to use as the main image. And let me show you the final image with everything composited and cleaned up. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope it was very informative and helpful. In the future, I'm hoping to do a second video in the same vein as this one and talk about doing gradiated light on shiny bottles, which I've done an absolute ton of doing hair care products in the past. Stay tuned or subscribe so that you can find out when that one's coming out. I hope to do it fairly soon. Have a wonderful day. Bye.